I think that what is unique about this organization is that students run it, and they are the primary force driving it, and they have been now for 7 years. I'm called the faculty advisor, and I've been involved from the very beginning, but I couldn't do it on my own. And the way universities operate in Canada, and I think it's true in the United States as well, is that when students demonstrate a commitment to something, university administrations will take action. When professors suggest doing things, not much happens. And so the fact that students have dedicated thousands of hours of work over the years to this is very special, but it's also why it is where it is. And it began because in 2013, 2014, in those years, what was happening in Israel and Palestine was particularly violent, and what had been happening, especially in the summer of 2014 when Israel invaded the Gaza Strip. And of course, it was all over the news in Canada, and everyone in a university was concerned about it and wanted to be able to do something to respond to it. And of course, we were helpless. If you were in Beirut at the time, you would have been much closer. And this is that's kind of the origin was, what can we do in response to conflict other than study it? And so the decision was to start to form an organization that could provide scholarships to students who are affected by war. And at the same time, as you picked out in your questions, Josiane, to educate the university and the local community about the effect of war at the same time, because people have lots of questions, there's lots they don't understand. And in order to be able to respond effectively, we need to understand it and to study it. And so the organization has two objectives. One is to provide scholarships, the other is education. And they are parallel, and they work together to make ISOW, as we call it, what it is. The ISOW has a student executive team that manages the whole thing. We have an intern, perhaps similar to Jane and Huri's roles, who's a paid employee of the university, who helps manage the details and provide continuity. And then there's a faculty advisor in my capacity to provide oversight. The university has an advisory council that we are accountable to, that meets 2 or 3 times a year, and that's made up of senior administrators that we must explain what we're doing, how we're doing it, and that's to make sure that we are not doing anything that will get the university into trouble or embarrass the university, and that we're being consistent with university policies. So that's the structure that exists. You asked the question about the target population and who is eligible for these services. So this is a really interesting question for us, because unlike many programs, and particularly the WUSC program, we don't focus exclusively on refugees. In other words, convention refugees or someone who is formally considered a refugee. Our concern is a little bit broader, and it's for somebody who may not have left their country, they may not have even have left their home, but whose education has been negatively impacted by war. So in the case of Syria, most of our students came straight from Syria and were trying to study at the University of Damascus or in Aleppo or in Homs. And those universities were continuing to operate, but it was dangerous, and the quality of the education had suffered greatly. And so we were able to bring them to Canada on international student visas, not as refugees. And so that it's different, and the process is different. And in fact, it's very difficult for an international student from Syria to get to Canada, because the government says, well, you should come as a refugee because we assume you will not go back to Syria. And so the government is rejecting most of the visa applications for students from Syria. We have been able to work with the government to develop a separate visa exception, really, for those students that works within the Canadian immigration system. And that's how that's why we focus on international students rather than as refugees. Now, some of the students look like refugees in the sense that a couple of them came from Lebanon, a couple came from Turkey, others had left Syria, been in the UAE, been in Oman, and gone back to Syria. So their experiences were very similar to those of refugees, but they weren't convention refugees, and and most of them are the majority are still in Syria. So that's who we are dealing with. We have there's been sort of been three groups of students that we're focusing on. There's Syrian students, there's Palestinian students. We have two Palestinians. We're looking at a third one now. And then this year, we have added Myanmar to our focus. And we have our first student right now who's studying from Myanmar. Because of the pandemic, she's in Myanmar, and she's studying remotely online. And we hope to bring two more from Myanmar in September. So we are focusing particularly on places where that conflict is very real and has a big impact, and trying to provide some help to some students from countries where violence has a huge impact.
Yeah, just for clarification, as I'm not very familiar with the law in Canada, so what would the difference? So why would you want them as international students rather than the refugee? Wouldn't it be better for them to come as a refugee status when it comes to the social system, the care, their access to health insurance, and all the social security benefits?
Well, that's really good question. So yes, a refugee, someone who comes to Canada as a refugee, has a lot of benefits, and as soon as they arrive in Canada, they have access to all those social supports that you talked about. But the two reasons why we don't do that. One is the refugee pathway is slow. For somebody you have to be sponsored to come to Canada as a refugee. Our refugee program requires either government sponsorship or private sponsorship, and it usually takes a minimum of 2 years for somebody to be sponsored. Right now, it's even slower than that. We could be 3 or 4 years at the moment, and so and the government has a quota, a limit on the number of refugees that it will accept every year. So that's the main reason. An international student, of course, can come more quickly. Right? If you qualify for the visa, then we can do that within 3 or 4 months. And so it gives them an opportunity. At the same time, Canada has a process when you are an international student. When you finish your degree, you can apply for a work permit to stay in Canada and to move towards Canadian residency status. So that is what our students are actually doing. It's a different pathway to the same outcome. And most of the students, so far we've sponsored 21 students, and most of them, all but one of them, have stayed in Canada. And so it's a faster pathway. But the other reason, of course, is that there are people in Syria who are affected by the war and who we feel are deserving of support, as well as people who have left the country and are former refugees. So we don't want to limit the scope of the scholarship just to someone who's left the country. This leads to really interesting conversations with people at the United Nations, UNHCR, because their focus is entirely on refugees, or internally displaced people is the other term. But we're broader than that, and sometimes people don't understand. Well, why would you do that? And it's an interesting question, right? And it's not one that I'm 100% sure we've got it right at the moment, because when people choose to stay in their country for various reasons, right? That they're afraid of what they will lose if they leave their country. And I think we have an image of refugees that perhaps needs to be a bit broader in our definitions. But those are some personal thoughts.
That's really interesting. Like I had an internship with IOM, and I know this dynamic when it comes to assistance for refugees. And I think like you're one of it's the first time I hear about this aspect of focusing on the people not only that are directly affected by the crisis, but like on taking a more global perspective or general one. So that's a very interesting approach, which I really salute you for, since based on my own experience, I know that a lot of refugees are not only the ones that are directly affected or are currently based in Syria, but there's much more global diaspora, or if I may say that. So that would lead me to my second question. So is there any specific criteria, or do you have a checklist or something that would help for the admissibility or the admission to your university, to the programs? So what are the main criteria other than those like affected by war? Or I assume that you might have a more broader list rather than just having this general idea of people affected by war.
Well, and it's a really difficult process. Yeah. Right now, we are selecting 2 new students from Myanmar and 1 new student from the Middle East. And of course, when you start looking at the applications and the profiles, they're all just deserving of a scholarship. And it's really hard to know, how do you decide who should get the scholarship? Is it need? And how do you define need? Is it financial need? Is it danger? Is it family circumstances? So the other part that makes the ISOW program unique, and it comes to a question you have later on, is that we have formal partnerships with organizations. So Jusur Syria, which you of course will know, and then also an organization called Daughters for Life. I don't know if you've heard of Daughters for Life. It's a Canadian organization founded by a Palestinian doctor. And when we make those agreements with those organizations, they help us in two ways. One is they provide some financial support for the scholarship, and the second is that they help us with the selection of the students. And so they do the call for applications, and then they do the screening of the applications originally. Now they have their own criteria, and we let them use those criteria to create a short list. And then when they have a short list, we join them together. Some of our students join the interviews, and we have these strong conversations about which is the right student to choose. But in Canada, the way our universities are structured is that students pay fees, small fees, as part of their being students. So there's tuition fees, right, with thousands of dollars. But then there's then they pay lots of little fees every year, right? They may pay a fee for health services or for athletic facilities. Usually there'll be 10 or 12 different fees. And in Canada, students can vote to introduce another fee. And it's a tax, really, and every student pays it. And so we have a fee that every student pays. And so it's $4 every term that a student pays. And that becomes the foundation for the scholarship, is that every year they collect about 150,000 Canadian dollars for that scholarship. And that's the foundation. The partner organization provides some, and then the university provides some as well. And that's the second advantage, is that, and I think European, if you were at Sciences Po, I'm guessing it was a little different than it is in Canada and the United States. I suspect Jane and Larry can speak to this, but in North America at the moment, we put a lot of emphasis on experiential learning. I don't know if you're familiar with that term in France, but experiential learning is practical, applied work that contributes to your education. So not only do you study refugees academically, but through this program, you support refugees and you make decisions and you sponsor them. And for the university, that's something that universities see as very important today, is opportunities for students to have experiences. And that's why the university supports the program primarily, is because the students are leading it in getting academic credit for their work and getting experience. So that without the student leadership, this wouldn't be happening.
I think you've answered my question on funding, and I based, like, since I'm a young graduate, I think that this experiential learning and experience would be very beneficial, especially later on in the work environment. And people usually, like, during my experience in refugee camps, I learned much more than I was learning in books, and you get to have a wider perspective towards what's happening, what are the refugees passing through. So it's much more than theory or like the convention and the law that would provide refugees with their rights. So what's written on paper is different than what is available, or what's present in reality. So how many students have accessed or graduated from your program so far, and do you usually keep in contact with them? So for instance, we have here in Lebanon the Fulbright program, which usually, like, students have to, after graduating, has a certain time that they need to come back to Lebanon and work, just as a way of giving back to what they have received, or just giving back to their country. So I was wondering, so with your alumni, how do you keep in, do you stay in touch with them? What are they currently doing? And what's next after the graduation?
Well, we're learning right now what comes next. So we've sponsored 21 students so far. 8 of them are master's students and 15 of them are undergraduate students. And 16 of them have graduated. And they've graduated all in the last 2 or 3 years. That's why we're now learning what happens. We're working hard to create an alumni network. Because the students we sponsor, we call them scholars. They have a lot to contribute and to give back, and many of them want to. wherever they are in the world, they can do so. And so this year we have been involving them in workshops and to help the student leaders learn from them. So we hope that in the future that they will be able to support us, guide us, maybe be on a board, an alumni board. We have one of the areas that we are working on is social media, and so some of the alumni are helping us monitor our social media so that when the students are doing it, that they're doing it well and they're not making mistakes, because we don't want to make mistakes on social media. So some of the alumni are helping monitor that. That's one contribution they're making. But I think we don't know yet what the potential is because it's still young. But I think there will be a strong network, and maybe in the future it could lead to financial, someone finding a donor to help support more scholarships. And we really have two groups of alumni. We have the scholars that have been supported, but then we have all the student leaders who have been part of it. So there's more than 100 student leaders who graduated in that. So there's two groups. We try and keep in touch with both of them. But that's a new challenge we're facing.
Yeah, and this would take me to the question on your future plans and how would you evaluate the success of your programs? And are there any areas like that you were able to, maybe gaps? I won't say like some gaps or some plans you are working on improving in for the future, or you have learned from your previous graduates. Like I assume that those that already graduated have taught you a lot. So what are any future plans you're working on? What are your areas of improvement?
So yes, I think the program has been successful. The program, as with every program, there are lots of challenges and difficulties, and sometimes you just want to give up because it always involves personalities and it involves government and administration. None of that is easy to navigate. But I think I personally have learned a great deal through the process, and I found it very worthwhile. One of the challenges, but also strengths of the program is the support of the students, the scholars, when they are here. And I think the strength is that, of course, there's students that are willing to help. Right? And so the students that lead the team, they're there to help the scholars. And so that's really helpful. But there's more, it takes more than that. You were an international student in Paris, so you know what it feels like to be in another country. And you're from a country that has been in difficulties. And so you know some of the challenges that go with that. And so supporting the students to success, I think, is something that it's easy to overlook, right? Many organizations just want to give them money and then move on. We're very proud of the fact that we're able to provide personal support. And my wife is a social worker, and she's part of the program. She with me. She's always involved with the students and the scholars, and she gets to know them. And because all of our students have been women except for one. So that's important to have a female role model there. And so my wife plays that role to help. And I think that's all really a part of what makes this successful. We have two future plans that I think are most important. One of them has to do with the fact that we're not very flexible. Because we have partner organizations, I think you saw this, a student has to apply through that partner organization to get the scholarship.
Yeah.
So they have to apply through ISOW. But just last week, I got a message from the WUSC program. They said, we have a student from Somalia who's not a convention refugee. Can you help her? We think she wants an education, then she wants to go back to Somalia. And my answer is, no, we can't help her because we don't have an organization helping us with Somali students. And so one of our goals is to be more flexible and to work out how somebody from Somalia or somebody from Libya or somebody from Venezuela, perhaps, could still get a scholarship if we could find the financial support even though we may not have a formal organization. And that's going to take us quite a long time to work, but I want to do that with the organizations, is to be able to be more flexible and to be able to respond to needs for someone who's not a refugee. The second program that we're working on is in Canada, as in the United States and in Europe, we have many people who have come as refugees and are already in Canada who need help going to university. And there are different obstacles to them going to university. Some of it is financial, but others, can be family concerns, the fact that they need to work to support their families.
Yeah.
And so we are now working on a refugee scholarship that is concentrating on someone who's already in Canada to help them with their education, using the same networks and processes we have in place for international students, but focusing on someone who's here. That program we're almost got it started. Another year and it'll be ready to go.
I really hope that you'll be able to move forward with these plans. I assume they'll be helpful for a lot of students, especially those that are in very harsh conditions. And I know, like the refugees that are currently in Canada and don't have access to education, it must be really harsh, because like the ones that are here in Lebanon, they came for a better life, for better opportunities, and then when they are stuck and found in a totally different country and different culture, and maybe sometimes they don't speak the language, it gets a bit tough for them. So having an integration program and taking them into consideration would be very helpful. And if I want to ask you that, if you want to provide like a small piece of advice, or just if you've got the chance to give a lesson for other organizations that are planning to go into the field of assisting refugees, maybe around the world, within the United States, like aside, like what they can learn from your organization or from the dynamics present for students within Canada, in order like just to have a broader perspective, maybe, or just to learn from you.
Boy, no one's asked me that before, so that's interesting. One lesson I think is that every country, it's going to be different depending on the country that you're working in, and because government plays a big part in this, and so not only that, but how education is structured in a country, and then the United States, of course, has its own circumstances with government and with the way that President Trump changed immigration, and so that affects everything that a university or someone wants to do in the United States. And in Canada, we have the refugee program, we have the international student visa program that we're able to work with. So I guess that's my first lesson, is that you have to understand what your own country's opportunities and limits are to this. The other thing, of course, Josiane, is that in Canada, we're an island. And unlike Lebanon or unlike France, we choose who comes, right? And you don't have any choice in Lebanon or in France, really. You had millions of refugees crossing into Europe. And so universities and governments had to respond to that. In Canada, we get to choose who comes here. And those circumstances are really, really important to understand. Universities as well have different cultures. And each university likes to think of itself in different ways. And Sciences Po, for example, has a certain intellectual culture. And I think that affects things as well, right? The president of the university, in our case, wanted to help and wanted to enable us to do this work. And the president was able to make it possible to support us. On the other hand, so you get the example, Jane and Huda give the example of Kyle Farnbury at Rutgers. Well, Kyle made it possible for UARRM to be established, I think. And if you don't have somebody like that, then it's very difficult to do anything. It's productive. Yeah. You need someone at the highest levels of a university, administrative levels, who can provide funding and support. So there's a national culture and there's university cultures. I guess the third lesson I would say is that there will always be conflict and problems with these programs. That people have opinions, people have different ways of approaching them. And there are, even though organizations may look like they have similar goals, those goals are not usually quite the same. And so the work requires a compromise, and it requires negotiation and effective communication if it's going to work. And those are challenging and they are time consuming, but the rewards, of course, are wonderful. The rewards are wonderful for the scholars that we sponsor, but they're also wonderful for us because we have the privilege of having them at our university, and we learn so much in the process. So those would be 3 lessons that I would say I've learned.